issues of the country. Education basically is interwoven now into partisan politics in unprecedented ways in this country. And, if somebody's going to comment on what's going on, you almost have to read the newspapers every day. It's changing that quickly. It's a dynamic and in many ways a very scary situation. So what I will do is basically start by one of the things I've discovered, and I discovered this as a school board member in New Rochelle, New York, and we'd go to dinner parties, and I was on the board, as president of the board, and all of my friends, they were pretty well-educated people. New Rochelle's a pretty sophisticated community. It's a city, but pretty sophisticated. Nobody, these were lawyers and doctors and well-educated executives and so forth. They didn't have the vaguest idea about the basic organization and structure of American education. So I want to preface my comments by just going over some of the fundamentals of the organizational and structural nature of the enterprise. It's a very fragmented and decentralized system. Education is essentially legally a state responsibility. So when New York City or Chicago or LA wants to centralize or decentralize their urban districts, they have to find out where the state capital is. And for New York City people to go to Albany, or Chicago people to go to Springfield, Illinois, or St. Louis people to go to Jefferson City, the urban-rural conflict is there. And basically, states can create and dissolve school districts at will. So people have to understand that although it's a state function, historically, operational responsibility has been given to these kind of unique American entities called local school boards. And there are 13,000 of them in the country, ranging from New York City, which educates 1,100,000 kids, to some one-room or two-room schoolhouse out in rural Kansas or Nebraska, and everything in between. So one really has to understand this basic structure. There's a theology of localism that is extremely strong. And people make their fundamental lifestyle decisions to understand the theology. And everybody's a liberal till their kids or their grandkids are involved. And basically they will make their major moves, there are exceptions to this, according to the reputation of the school district, wherever it may be. I've moved around the country. I can't hold a job, so I used to move every 4 or 5 years. And basically the first thing I did was to look at the quality of the school system. And basically people are liberal, progressive, et cetera, but I think the transcendent goal is to find the best school for your own kids or your own grandkids. And that's a very dominant attitude and reinforces the strong local nature and the theology of localism, which is very, very strong, throughout the country. Now, most of the world basically has centralized educational systems. France, for example, in Paris, they'll decide the curriculum, teacher salaries, et cetera. And this is true in Asia and Africa and so forth. So our fragmented, decentralized system is kind of very, very unique to the United States. It has advantages and it has disadvantages. And we can maybe talk about those in the question and answer session. But we have this decentralized, fragmented system. And what the country has gone through COVID and the debates about whether to open schools or close schools took place in every community at the local level. And local school boards were faced with these no-win decisions, whether to mask, vaccination, and so forth. And the pressure on local school boards, because this is where these decisions have been made, has been acute. And the COVID fragmentation in terms of policy and so forth kind of reflects the fragmentation of the system at large. Again, you got 13,000 school systems, 50 state legislatures, 100,000 different schools. And whatever you want to say is true, whatever you want to say is false about American education, is extremely difficult to generalize about it. Let me briefly talk, particularly to a Washington-based crowd. There's a great misunderstanding of the role of the federal government. We have a federal system, as we all know, shared governance responsibility between local government, state government, in some cases, intermediate government, and the federal government. Historically, the federal government has always been a very junior partner in terms of K-12 education. Now, one of the limitations of my presentation, I'm not going to be talking about post-secondary or higher ed. We can talk about that in the question and answer session. I'm going to be largely focusing on K-12 education. And what's happened essentially is that the federal role, until very recently, has been minimal in the United States. Through most of our history, they've picked up maybe 3 or 4% of the total bill for public education. So it's largely been a local and state financial responsibility as well. And I'll talk a little later in terms of some of the backlash against the recent federal role. But historically, we have not had a cabinet level position for education until 1979. That's very recent. And the old US Office of Education, Mary and some others may remember it, was buried in the bowels of the old Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And in 1979, Jimmy Carter owed some favors to the NEA, and they created this cabinet level position. And most people in education favored it. They thought that education was significant enough that it merited the kind of visibility that a cabinet level position would provide in the federal government. There was one outstanding visible opponent of creating a cabinet position, and that happened to be Al Shanker, the iconic president who passed away in 1997, the president of the AFT. And Al said in 1979, and he had virtually no support within the education community for it. He said, the minute you pull the E away from H, health, and W, welfare, you're diluting some of the political power and influence. It's a very interesting position. And if you look at the problems that we have now, and I'll get to that in a minute, we're over half the kids in the United States are eligible for reduced school lunch. And basically families need a whole array of supports that only general purpose government can provide. The other fundamental I'd like to stress is that schools historically, well, dating back to the turn of the 20th century anyway, have been separated from general purpose government. In other words, school board elections in most jurisdictions are held at a separate time than general purpose elections. We elect our governors, our president, our mayors, our city councils, our county councils in the fall, in November. Most school board elections are held in April in most states. And school board elections, that's a whole other issue that we can talk about later. But the turnout is extremely minimal. It might change because of some of the factors I'll talk about, but there's been very little attention paid in newspapers to school boards as entities. But somehow or other, we've got to break down the institutional isolation of schools from general purpose government, because the majority of kids and families need the social services, the health services, they need the connections that general purpose government provides. And having the schools as kind of a fortress mentality, I think is very dysfunctional. There are a bunch of us who've been writing about this for years. We've gotten absolutely no traction. We can talk about the mayoral control issue a little later, but that just affected only a handful of major cities, although it got a lot of public attention. I want to focus on Woodrow Wilson had 14 points. I mercifully will only have 9 that basically will discuss some of the major changes. I've been floating around these issues for more than 60 years now. And I want to talk about some of the changes and put today's events in the context of these 9 kind of fundamental issues that I want to talk about. Most significantly, and this is really taking place in the last 2 or 3 months in this country, there's a new politics of education now, where school boards have been politicized in unprecedented ways, and school issues have become part of partisan politics in ways that has never happened before. Schools have always been political because you're talking about the investment of large amounts of public monies and so forth, but the issue has become partisan. You look at the efforts of groups now around the country pouring millions of dollars into local school board elections. California, I just read this morning, the Republican Party in California, I think as we all know, is a very heavily blue state, but the Republican Party is investing millions of dollars in local school board elections.
Oh, awful.
So people are going to be voting on a partisan basis. There are a handful of states that school board elections or school board nominees have a partisan affiliation, but that's only a tiny, tiny group of states, maybe 3 or 4, and that may have changed too. I just don't know. But you look at what's happening in Florida, you look at the fact that LGBTQ issues, sexuality issues, you can't say the word gay in Florida, the constraints on teachers, the basically kind of suppression of the freedom of teachers, if you will, its impact, and this is spreading all over the country. It isn't just Florida and Texas and a handful of other places. 32 state legislatures, again, and these are the supreme school boards in each of the states, are Republican dominated. And this kind of legislation is just sweeping the country. And its impact on teacher recruitment and retention in terms of suppression of teacher creativity. And so we can't begin to know what the implications are. And again, you read about this every day in the newspaper. This is a very recent phenomenon. The second major point relates to the demographics of this country. It's a different country. There's a demographic transformation that's taken place. The white population is the lowest it's ever been in our history. It's about 58%. The schools are already minority majority. A minority, defined as someone of color, it's a very complicated issue. Hispanics identify themselves as Caucasians, etc. But the reality is that the demographics have changed dramatically. The kids under 16, the minority are white, and our semantics have to change. The DC schools for years has had a majority of African-American kids, and this has been called a minority. I've never been much of a mathematician, but anything over half isn't a minority. So our semantics and our definitions of a minority and majority have to change. My grandkids are minorities in this country. It's this diversity is hitting the schools first. Of course, the lower down in the grades you go, the greater, I should say the lesser is that's a terrible way of expressing it, of the Caucasian or the white population. In 2018, these figures stunned me. The median age of whites was 58, Asians 29, and Latinos 11. So you can begin to see, what the future of the country is demographically. A terrific source of information, William Fry, who's a demographer at the Brookings Institution, has written something called Diversity Explosion, in which he documents what's gone on, not just in the Southwest with the Mexican American population, or in the Northeast with the Central American population. It's everywhere. 35% of the kids in the South Carolina schools are of color. So it's ubiquitous. It's only the district of the metropolitan DC area is actually among the 10 most diverse regions in the country. In other words, only DC and our metropolitan area. The most diverse, and this won't surprise anybody, would be Metro San Francisco, the Bay Area, San Jose, which is almost in that catchment, and Houston, Texas, which will not be a surprise. And what's also going on demographically, which kind of reflects the political problems that those of us who believe in the politics of both coasts, and maybe Chicago and a handful of other places, geopolitically, the country, the population is shifting south and west. These are the states that are picking up seats in the Congress. These are the states that basically have been red. The third point in this 9-point presentation relates to the fact that in recent years, schools have been assessed on the basis of their outputs. In other words, our kids learning. For many, many years, nobody paid any attention to scores and testing and so forth. The schools would judge how much did they spend on salaries, how much did they spend on school plant and so forth. And the accountability and testing and standards movement began about 20 or 30 years ago. And in a little while, I'll talk about the backlash about that, particularly as the feds got into the game. But this has been very significant. And, the testing movement has become quite controversial because some people think it's become excessive, that everybody's teaching to the test. There's been a lot of cheating that's gone on and so forth. But some testing certainly is going to be necessary. But this is another issue that's going to be played out, I think, largely in the states in the years ahead. The fourth area would be choice and charters. And I think this is particularly relevant to DC. There's a broadened definition of public education now. The public schools used to have what, in essence, was a monopoly. Still, about 90% of the kids are in traditional public schools. But the charter movement basically started, I guess, maybe 30, 35 years ago in Minnesota. Ironically, our friend Mr. Shanker again was one of the first architects of it, which is kind of a paradox being head of the teacher union, because most unions are not thrilled with the charter movement. They feel it'll pull resources and middle and upper middle class kids out of the public schools. But Shanker looked at the New York City schools. He was president of the United Federation of Teachers before he came down here to become president of the National Union, and said they're failing about 60 or 70% of the kids. Why not have some teacher-run charter schools that basically could ignore some of the constraints of the typical urban school bureaucracy and try different things with these kids that the schools are not serving well. And the charter movement has picked up a lot of momentum. It's sanctioned in about 43 states. Essentially, it's gotten more play than the figures or the percentage of kids who are in charter schools nationally. These are national figures. Maybe 7 or 8% of the kids, of the 50 million kids who are in public schools, roughly 50 million kids are in charter schools. But the charter schools are strongest in areas like DC, New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, and get visibility beyond their numbers because the congressmen work in DC, they read the Washington Post. The New York Times, charters are strong in New York City. Basically, New York Times obviously has a national readership, the Los Angeles Times and so forth. The situation in DC is particularly interesting and unique, as Mary will attest. Almost half the kids are in charter schools, and there's a separate charter board that authorizes these schools. But this isn't the norm, and I think it's worked pretty well in Washington. I don't know, Mary would know more about it than I do, really, but the charter board has worked pretty well with the traditional board, although there's rivalry and tension for space and so forth. But the charter movement is really the best example of people looking for choice. And if one, there's, I think, a good argument for choice. Most people of means, middle income, upper middle income, everybody we all know on this call, essentially, we could pick our schools. We could move to a suburban community. We could opt to have our kids. We have choice. And the fact that the people have citizens who have been most ill-served, if you will, in the schools, don't have that choice. They're locked into certain kinds of neighborhoods, and they're economically restrained and constrained. So we have a broadened definition of public education. But again, almost 90% of kids are in traditional public school systems around the country. The fifth issue is technology. And any of my grandkids would be infinitely better equipped to discuss this issue than I am. But obviously, virtual learning, what's happened with Zoom, triggered by COVID, et cetera, the opportunities are just enormous. And obviously, the technology is not a panacea, as we've discovered. Basically, people need social interaction. Hybrid models will be evolving. But the schools are going to be in the middle of this issue in terms of how to handle it. And if we have another wave in the pandemic, a number of physicians say we're not out of the pandemic phase, and the schools will be in the middle of this again. Working mothers, the custodial role of the school as well as the academic role of the school. So many single parent households, particularly in economically disadvantaged communities, they have to go to work, and they can't work and generate an income if their kids aren't in school. So, but technology has enormous opportunities in terms of being creative. The next item I'd mention, this would be 6, would be continuing shifts in the cycles of the federal system, if you will, in terms of the federal role. Somebody's, okay. I was picking up some sound, some vibe. As long as they weren't boos, we'll go on.
I was trying to figure out where it was coming from, sorry.
Okay.
It was Tony Lynn.
I'm used to booze. So
Thanks, Diana.
I don't mean liquor, I mean booze. Okay. Continuing shifts in the cycles of federalism in terms of education. Again, as I said earlier, historically, the federal role has been very, very minimal. 4% of the budget, largely research, demonstration projects. The U.S. Office of Education was not a very potent force until the 1960s in the Johnson administration, when the Civil Rights Act was passed in 64, I guess, and they began to desegregate the Southern schools after the Brown decision, 10 or 12 years after the Brown decision in 54. Let me add parenthetically that the role, although the feds have had a minimal role historically, in terms of the legislative branch, the federal judiciary has had an extraordinarily influential role in education, as well as on abortion and church-state relationships and more contemporary issues. dating back the Brown decision, obviously eliminating de jure school segregation in 54, a decision in Oregon permitting citizens, the Pierce decision, to send their kids, parents could send their kids to non-public schools, school finance issues. The federal government, under the Rodriguez decision, had no constitutional obligation to try to equalize school funding. So the federal courts have been very influential. But again, in terms of the executive branch, the U.S. Office of Education, again, until the civil rights issue of the cities was not very influential. And it wasn't until 2001 with the No Child Left Behind legislation that the feds got involved in any manner, shape, or form in classroom activities. The federal government is banned from getting involved in curriculum. It's very explicit. Again, the influence of local and state control of education. And the federal government essentially in 2001 with the testing regimen, they had to test kids in third grade, fifth grade, eighth grade testing and so forth. And that created a tremendous backlash politically. The local and state authorities, which were picking up 92% of the bill, did not think the junior financial partner should demand 100% of the accountability. And a backlash set in. And basically, I think we're in a period now of kind of reversion, if you will, where the locals and states have the authority and the feds under the new legislation. The original ESEA was reauthorized, I guess, in 2015, and the localities of the states now have much more influence, and the feds have less because, again, this political equation didn't hold, that somebody paying a tiny percentage of the bill had this kind of influence. And a lot of the teacher unions and traditionally Democratic people, big D Democrats, agreed with this. And in any event, this federally demanded accountability boomeranged. Whether we will come back to that or not sometime, I don't think it'll be my lifetime, but the issue is that the country faces in terms of international competition. Can we afford this fragmented system if we're going to compete with China and so forth? Because the research and development capacity of the states is very limited. State education departments, which have been delegated the operational responsibility for state policy, have never been supported by the states. And really, we're not given very much life until Title V of the original ESCA was passed. So can we compete with this fragmented system that we have? And particularly with the attitudes towards the federal government, where the country is politically, I think we're not going to go back to a strong federal role, at least in terms of educational policy, for the formidable, predictable future. The impact, I'll touch very minimally on the lack of contact between elementary and secondary education and post-secondary education. K-12 is the elementary and secondary system, and then we have the post-secondary system, which is community colleges, technical institutes, universities, graduate schools, that whole panoply of higher ed institutions. And again, we have kind of a structural anomaly in the United States. They're separate worlds. K-12 is on one planet and post-secondary is the other planet. And there are minimal opportunities, essentially, or examples, is a better way of saying it, of them working as closely together as they must on admissions policy, on placement policy, and they're separate. In most states, there are separate boards governing K-12 and post-secondary education. I think one of the really important institutions in the future is going to be the community colleges. They're getting increased attention. I think Dr. Jill has obviously played a role in terms of the visibility that they've received. I think they're very, very important institutions. The problem is they're minimally supported. They don't have football teams or tickets to distribute to legislators for Big Ten football games on Saturdays. They're kind of the colleges in many ways of the forgotten Americans, but they are very, very significant institutions because we've had, I think, in this country, kind of a mindless academic escalation and have moved away from technical kinds of education. And you have a situation increasingly where people with bachelor's and master's degrees are going back into community colleges to get a job, to pick up a marketable skill. But community colleges essentially, I think, are very important, particularly in light of the demographic shifts, as mechanisms for transfer to four-year institutions, and more importantly, to provide vocational and technical skills. But there's still a problem we have in our society in which there's a stigma attached to vocational and technical education. And people all want their kids to go to a four-year liberal arts college, and they'll get out and they probably increasingly won't be able to get a job because those jobs have vanished, those entry jobs. And they, after a couple of years of living at home, they either get kicked out or leave and go to a community college so they can get a job. John, and part of it is the fact that as a society, we don't value vocational and technical training. I know when I have to call a plumber or somebody, I'm envious of their hourly rates. And secondly, they have a set of skills that are very important. Electricians and plumbers and so forth. And John Gardner, a wonderful man, those of us with gray hair will remember him as Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare in the Johnson administration. In his book, Excellence, it's a wonderful quote. A society which scorns plumbing because it is a humble activity and tolerates shoddiness in philosophy because it is an exalted activity, will have neither good plumbing or philosophy, neither its pipes or theories will hold water. Wonderful, wonderful quote. I wish I was smart enough to come up with a quote like that, but I'm not. But in any event, I think we're going through an adjustment in higher ed where people are beginning to question on a practical basis the incredible tuitions that are being charged, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year, and kids are getting out in an economy and they can't get jobs. And so that hopefully technical and vocational skills will be prized more. And another issue, I think this is number 8. So again, I'm coming to an end. Relates to the early childhood education issue. Everybody always pays homage to it, only Head Start, preschool. The psychologists have all kinds of documentation of how important the early years are, prenatal, neonatal, all it. And, we've made it some investment, but if they may be gone tomorrow and I had scarce resources, I'd probably pour an inordinate amount of it into early preschool because teachers in schools by the 2nd or 3rd grade level, they know which kids are going to move ahead in academics and which kids aren't. And the issue has picked up visibility, but too much of it has been rhetorical support. And then my 9th point would relate to the enduring impact of school finance and the inequality of educational opportunity. We have a school finance structure really that makes the rich richer. It's still heavily predicated on property taxes, which of course are locally raised. And people that have expensive homes and, living in choice suburban communities or choice neighborhoods can raise more money for laboratories, for computers, for technology, for foreign languages, all these embellishments to school programs that kids who are less fortunate do not have. And again, we have this structure of localism. It's going to be very tough to break that because, again, it's the albatross of liberalism that people are going to, make the school decisions that are going to give their kids a step up, particularly in the kind of world we're currently living in. And we have a situation with the changing demographics where school segregation, despite 50, 60 years of integration being a major public policy issue, where school segregation is growing. The whole issue of role models for these new populations or new majority in the schools. Only 1% of Latinos and Latino, it's a tough definition because again, the Hispanic population is so terribly diverse that I'm not sure even when you mention the word what it means, but 1/5 of Americans do identify being Hispanic. I mean, you go to Colorado and Hispanics have been there for 6 and 9 generations. So it's a very hard group to try to label accurately. But only 1% of the Latinos, however identified, attend schools where the preponderance of teachers equals, in terms of their backgrounds, their ethnic backgrounds, percentage of the students. So in other words, there aren't any role models for 1% of well, it would be 99% of the Latino kids, 4% of the Asian kids, 7% of the African-American kids, and 99% of the white kids are in schools where the majority of the teachers are of the same ethnic background as the students. And some of the numbers on wealth in this country, and we've all read about it, where 50%, and as it pertains to education, 50 of the richest Americans are worth as much as the poorest 165 million Americans. The richest 10% own 60% of the wealth, and the top 1% of earners basically generate 30% of the income in the country. I mean, these are the seeds of revolution somewhere downstream in terms of these kinds of gross inequities. And you've seen figures, CEOs now make 300 times as much as the average worker. It used to be 20 or 40 times as much, and so forth. 20% of the kids have no access to computers. In the age of COVID, kids have just disappeared, a million and a half kids. And so, we have a lot of problems. The mental health issue is hitting, it's ubiquitous in education. It's K-12, it's higher ed. Speak to people teaching at the college level, even schools like AU that attract, that have become quite selective and attract kids from upper income families that can afford to pay 60, 70 grand a year. The number of mental issues and breakdowns and et cetera, it's just escalating. And part of this is COVID, and part of it is, maybe other factors. The mental health, you read about so many kids in schools having issues with mental health, family issues. And again, over half the kids in the schools are of color, and only 3 or 4% of the mental health professionals are of color. So the need for role models. So I'm going to stop and, open it up. Didn't solve any issues. I'm always reminded after you give a presentation like that of Noah's principle that what ought to happen is there's a prize for building the ark and not predicting rain. And at least let me end on a positive note on a rainy day and kind of a gloomy presentation. With all the weaknesses of the American system, educational system, it's still probably was the greatest experiment in mass education ever undertaken in the history of the world. And again, with all our weaknesses and all our inequities, despite the problems and issues and so forth, maybe, we'll find a way of stumbling through this. But the schools should be the engine of social mobility. The public school. I mean, I'm a generation away from that myself. My father was an immigrant. He grew up in abject poverty, went to Stuyvesant High School in New York and became a dentist. So that's when the New York City schools were terrific. Teaching and working with, very, very poor families. Now, again, you can make the case they were motivated, education was important, and so forth. But we've got to find ways of generating more equity in our overall political system, and find some ways of. I don't see it on the immediate horizon, but somewhere downstream, of trying to do something about school finance to make it more equitable. And we just can't. I think with these populations coming up are going to have to provide greater efforts at equity, although it certainly is not on the immediate horizon. So Lynn, I'm going to stop there and let's open it up.
Okay, absolutely. So Diana had put a question into the chat. Diana, I see your hand is up. Do you want to ask it?
Yeah, I'll ask it, but I just wanted to, you've got a very long background in education, obviously. And I listened to, this extraordinary long list of things that are really fundamentally wrong with our education system. Do you have, even initial thoughts about how just a couple of things that can be done to improve the situation?
That's a very fair question, and goes back to Noah's principle, I guess. One of the things that's been suggested is that the feds basically are really the only entity with the fiscal flexibility to redress much of this. Remember, the states require balanced budgets. So, they have to live the way most of us live in state government. The budgets have to be balanced. The feds can print money. It creates all kinds of issues, and they're printing a lot of money these days. But the tax base that the feds have is, the leverage point somewhere downstream. Supreme Court made a decision in 1973, the Rodriguez case, 5-4 vote, 5-4 vote. Basically, again, saying that that the feds had no constitutional obligation, that it was a local and state. Now, had that decision gone the other way, I know the National Education Association for years unsuccessfully has pushed for the feds to pick up at least a third of the bill instead of 8 or 9% of the bill for elementary and secondary education. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it, because of the centrality of the states, is to basically have the state assume all responsibility for elementary and secondary education. And that way you will not have the intra-state inequities in terms of policy funding schools. The intrastate. And that would be another way of doing it. But again, the money and the power is with local school districts, and they'd be, I think, very reluctant, particularly the wealthier districts, to be a party of this, because again, they'd want to perceive as their own kids' advantages. So, in the finance issue, those are two impractical suggestions in the current political environment. The other piece, of course, we have a tremendous shortage of teachers in certain areas. And it's a qualitative issue too, that isn't addressed as openly as possible, because you look and see what's happened to talented women who 50 and 60 and 70 years ago might have gone into teaching, but now are lawyers and doctors, and this is wonderful. This is progress. I don't want to get into trouble with anybody. I'm not saying, hey, there's anything wrong with this. This is terrific. But it's a qualitative issue. It's not that we don't have some wonderful quality teachers, but a lot of this academic talent of good teachers has been siphoned off. Medical school, the majority of medical school students are now female. Engineering, it's around 40%. Law, and this is wonderful progress, but somewhat paradoxically, it has a negative impact because the teaching force is still 80% female in this country. So if you could do something with teacher salaries and so forth. It began, the gender ratio was evened up a little bit at the time of the Vietnamese War. It's not that a lot of men didn't want to go into teaching, they wanted to avoid the draft. So, but those are a couple of suggestions that I don't think are very practical in this environment, political environment.
Got it. I see Tony and Carol have their hands up. So Carol, I think I saw yours first and then Tony.
Okay, Michael, thank you so much for joining the distinguished list of speakers that we've had, and you're incredibly passionate and knowledgeable, which I completely appreciate. And I want to bear down just a little bit more on where you were going with your comments on teachers. I look at what's going on in schools and analogize it in some respects to what's going on in healthcare too around COVID. I mean, nurses, physicians, they're in serious burnout. You add in, so that's also, I think, somewhat true by virtue of what happened in the schools with COVID. And you add in the politicization of schools beyond what we've had in the past. I mean, two-part question, how are the schools dealing with, and I just read mass media, I think there's something like 300,000 more teachers needed now than we have. And could you talk a little bit more about how you make sure over the next 5 to 10 years that we know where we're getting the next talented group from? Because if we aren't investing in the next generation and their educational capabilities, I mean, where are we going as a country?
Okay, you were a little cracked up, Carol. I don't mean you personally cracked up, but I didn't quite get I think I got the gist of your question.
Okay.
It's a real problem. And the reality is a lot of states have all these fancy certification requirements to be able to teach. But the reality is every fall when the kids come to school, you need a warm body in front of those 30 or 35 kids. And, they all have fancy requirements for science teachers, STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. But the talent is over in the private sector. And what's happening, with the politics, the partisan politics in schools, Republican, Democratic school boards, and so forth, is that it's going to make the case to go into teaching even tougher to recruit people. And in many ways, anachronistic certification requirements are a deterrent too. I always get into trouble when I say this because I'm a professor of education, or was a professor of education at a lot of places. But some of the certification requirements and courses that are required before you're able to teach are absurd. At a time we ought to be more creative. There are troops to teaching programs. People get out of the military at 40 or 45 or 50 and have technical skills. The Army, for example, in terms of language instruction in Monterey is state of the art. And there's all kinds of talent coming out of the military at age who could go into teaching. So getting back to the earlier question, one of the suggestions would be to make the certification requirements less onerous and more relevant in terms of supply and demand, and differentiated salaries. If you're going to get physics teachers and chemistry teachers in the schools, or science, essentially, you may have to pay them more. And the teacher unions don't like this. So every move you make, there's accountable. But it's a very acute problem in certain fields. Special education, it's much more acute. And in the sciences, it's, people with a background in chemistry, physics, or engineering, and so forth. And at a time where you need minority, or should I say majority talent, the private sector is getting these, the top-notch graduates coming out of historically Black colleges and so forth. They're moving into the private sector where you have the reward structure and the money. And so, Tony, I think you had a question.
I have a question. Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I love all the big issues that you're raising, and I'm glad you're taking a very liberal view of it. But I have a more specific question, and that's about the testing issue. I do remember. I think it was George Bush Jr. that put in the No Child Left Behind, which meant a whole lot more testing.
Right.
I think that's what you were referring to when you saw it got tough about 20 years ago, and now it's sort of we're turning against it. But I'm trying to understand the difference between that kind of testing and the kind of testing that my English grandchildren are having. Because when I watch what they're doing, they seem to be learning a lot, but they are constantly studying for the test.
Yes.
Everything they do has to do with the big test that's coming up 2 months, 6 months at the end of the year. Now, I don't know who's learning more. They seem to be learning a lot. But I think, is that a different type of testing?
Well, it's the way the results got rewarded. In other words, the pressure is on teachers and others. They're going to be assessed. I think one of the Achilles heel of that testing regimen that Bush 43 started with No Child Left Behind, it boomeranged. It was bipartisan. Ted Kennedy was on board. That's the way.
Right, in principle, it's nice.
So it isn't all on Bush 43. What's happened with it is that teachers were going to be evaluated on the basis of their student test scores.
Right.
And kids are coming to school, with all kinds of backgrounds, different kinds of homes where there were books. And there are all kinds of figures. I don't know what they are offhand, but before a kid even enters school at age 4 or 5, the kids coming from upper middle income families have 100 times the vocabulary. So they're going to test better. So the teachers, if the teachers are going to be assessed on the test scores, the principals are going to be assessed on the test scores.
But are they testing on the material that they're supposed to have learned, or are they testing on their sort of general ability to read and write?
General ability to read and write in too many cases. The curriculum wasn't the testing movement. And Mary, I love you to pipe in here because I know had a lot of experience in DC. Essentially, they were tested. The testing preceded the curriculum changes. So the teachers in many cases didn't have the opportunity even to present the curriculum. So the principals were evaluated on the basis of the test scores. You had the old superintendent of schools in Atlanta go to jail for playing around with the test scores, because that's the way educators would be. So these were the excesses of the testing movement.
I
But you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We hopefully.
But in England, I don't know whether the faculty is judged on whether their students get high A-level scores or whatever it is.
That's very different because, one of the advantages and disadvantages of our system, one of the advantages, you get a couple of different choices and options later in life. You may screw up as a kid, but at least you can, at age 22 or 24 or 26, through community, you can come back. In Europe, you take the 11+ exam or whatever it is, and you're kind of rooted either in an academic track or a vocational or technical track or something like that. So, yeah, Mary.
Yeah, well, in the district, we've used, and this happens elsewhere in the country, the tests that are used are not necessarily tied to the curriculum. and the curriculum that we had was thrown out some years ago. It is now being reestablished.
Oh.
But it was the schools, the principals and the teachers were being assessed on the basis of test results that weren't even tied to
What they were taught.
And one of the results has been that, people are judging the schools on that basis without taking into account what the kids are bringing to the school in terms of their relative advantage or disadvantage. And I mean, I can't imagine that people would approve of judging doctors on the basis in general of their, whether their patients recover. I mean, the oncologists would all lose their jobs because so many cancer patients can't be cured. Okay. And in addition, of course, if you look at doctors' patients, well, some of them smoke. Some of them way too much and then have problems associated with obesity. I mean, you can't blame the doctor for that, but to some extent, we have been doing that with the schools. And one of the unfortunate results, certainly in the district, has been that people gravitate to the schools with the most advantaged students because it looks like they're the best schools.
Right.
And people refuse to even consider their neighborhood school because of factors. They aren't asking, how would my child do at this school? But what are the overall test scores? Well, my child is not the average student. My child is the person that he or she is. And I want to know how he or she is going to do. But that's been a real problem.
Absolutely. There was a question Diana asked before in the chat that I don't, she wanted to know how we get more qualified teachers in our schools at every level.
I think,
Diana, if you want to
Emily,
unmute to add to that, feel free.
okay.
Emily,
I think we're going to have to pay them more.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to be nicer to them. I mean, people say awful things about teachers, and I think some of them are actually taking out their childhood experience with Miss Grinch. We don't talk about teachers nicely. We talk about them as though we don't respect them. And I think that's a part of the problem.
Emily, I think,
Yes, Mike, thank you very much for a very, very thought-provoking presentation. I have a question that's something you didn't address, and it's a smaller question that's of the issues that face us. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the home education movement. Is it growing? Is it a problem to our society? Is it useful in any way? How should we be handling it?
well, I think, I'm not certain of the numbers, Emily. I think it may be 1.5 million or 2 million kids are in homeschooling. Personally, it's my own opinion, I think one of the values of being with other people and going to school is got to get along with people in society. And the earlier you learn to accommodate to people and learn how to get along with people, it's very, very constructive. A lot of the core of the homeschooling movement is really the Christian fundamentalists who basically have very strong religious beliefs. And it's not very powerful in this section of the country, but certainly places in the Southwest and the Middle West, it's quite strong. And I guess if parents want to do that, I think they should be entitled to. The society would have an obligation to be sure there'd be a level of being able to be able to read and write and do certain basics. But there are a lot of kids getting out of our traditional schools who couldn't meet those criteria either now, quite tragically. So I don't think it's a terribly powerful force nationally. It is in some states. I don't have the numbers on it, but it's still a relatively group. But I think there has been some growth. I'm not sure how dramatic it's been. But again, it's part of this choice phenomenon. You're hearing increasingly about parental rights. These efforts now in these states where the schools have become so politicized and partisan, essentially the educational establishment, the teachers, the teacher unions, the school administrators are all part of this conspiracy, this anti-religious conspiracy, with liberal views on sexuality and teaching this horrible CRT, critical race theory. And so I think parents increasingly, this turmoil that's going to affect schools with its the partisan tinge now may move more people into homeschooling. They won't want their kids to be embroiled in all of this stuff. So I don't know.
I think when we all went to schools in part were socializing for us. And,
Yes.
We all more or less learned the same moral, ethical, educational constructs. And now that's much less prevalent and seems to be, in fact, in disfavor.
Yeah, well, we're in a society now where we don't know about truth and disinformation. And, again, it's a reflection of in the school, what's going on in the larger world. But,
That's
if
true.
I had answers to any of this stuff, I don't know. They'd send me to the UN or somewhere.
Well, You've certainly given us a lot to think about and shared a lot of great information. Thank you very, very much. I just want to remind everybody before you sign off that November 17th, we have another interesting CCC program. Dr. Sal Salvaggio is speaking on oral health. It's more than a nice smile. So please join us to learn about the importance of oral health. He is a really good presenter. I've heard great things about him. And again, this is open to the community. It's part of our varied and very interesting series, the CCC programs. And thank you to Emily, who's been helping to arrange and schedule these.
Thank you.
And Michael, thank you so very much. This was really interesting and definitely a great overview of so many of the concerns that we're facing in education.
And I would welcome the opportunity if anybody would like to follow up, work through Lynn, an affinity group, or on any of the issues which I touched on so necessarily superficially in the 40 minutes.
Absolutely. And, I had discussed
Thank
that
you.
with Mike, that we would be happy to set up, there's so much to talk about with education in America, that for those of you who are on the call and who are interested in continuing the conversation, we would be happy to set up like an affinity group where you meet on a regular basis to talk about some of these issues in more depth. And Mike very generously offered that he would be willing to be the host, if you will, for this group. And so please email me, shoot me an email, let me know that you're interested. I'll also be putting something in the email blast along with the recording from the session to see if others who possibly couldn't make it this evening but are interested in these issues would like to join you. So again, much thanks to everyone. Thank you for attending. And Mike, thank you so very much. Really a great
Pleasure.
presentation.
Thank you, Mike. Bye-bye.